Joshua Holland, a editor and reporter over at AlterNet and senior writer, in fact, and editor at AlterNet, alternet.org, has been keeping us up to track on all of this. And Joshua, you were there last night. What happened in Oakland?
Yeah, Tom.
Welcome back.
It was another hectic night in Oakland after a very peaceable day. So we saw kind of both sides of the Occupy Oakland action and what's been going on out there. During the day, there had been a very major protest that had successfully shut down the port of Oakland, the fifth busiest container port in the United States. It was a fairly dramatic victory for a small group of activists. And then later in the evening, things devolved pretty quickly. I took a dinner break and went back out there at about 10:30. There was a festive feeling in the air. I think that the activists were in a way celebrating their apparent victory during the day. And I was told by one, I'm not supposed to call them organizers because it's a non-hierarchical organization, but one of the people who's a key person out there, that the next stage for Occupy Oakland was to reclaim some abandoned buildings because they have a housing problem. That's one of the local problems that they're dealing with. And apparently a group of activists went and quote-unquote occupied a former housing shelter, a former homeless shelter. And pretty soon we started to get word, and there's a lot of rumors going around these things, so you never know if it's true or not, that there was a large police, a large number of police in riot gear massing to go and evict the people in that building. At this point, several hundred of the activists, maybe 200, went. The building is located maybe 3 blocks away from their main camp in front of City Hall. Went to this street a few blocks away, set up a barricade from, pieces of construction materials and garbage, et cetera, and soon thereafter, sure enough, I counted 16 vans filled with riot gear. There must have been about 300 there. The barricade was set on fire, and very quickly, what had been an extremely positive day, there had been 2 incidents of vandalism, but certainly no violence, no arrests, devolved into another one of these scenes similar to what we saw last Tuesday, with endless rounds of tear gas being fired, flashbang grenades, less lethal projectiles.
This was not at the port. This was at the homeless shelter?
No, this is not at the port. The port was an extremely nonviolent action. Nothing.
Very interesting, because the two have been conflated in the news. Joshua,
I heard NPR say that they had that this had been some violence and arrest of lingering protesters.
Right.
It's possible that there were some people at the port at 4 in the morning, for example. I left at about 3 in the morning.
Right.
But the action that I saw, where there was quite a bit of violence and a number of arrests, was at the homeless shelter.
Right. Okay. Two quick questions in the short time we have. The first is, if you look back at the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, the 60s was the time of the nonviolent civil rights movement. Turn the fire hoses on us, et cetera. And that produced the Great Society and a lot of changes. The 70s were a time of violent response. Cities were burned down, including Oakland. And frankly, it seems to me that produced social change as well. It was almost like, okay, the promise of the 60s hasn't been fulfilled. We're mad as hell. We're going to do something about it. Is it possible that we've been over-romanticizing the nonviolent aspects? Not that I'm advocating violence in any way,
right.
but that when a rigidified system of crony capitalism and crony politics is confronted repeatedly, that it will respond with violence. Well, this is my second question. We had on yesterday the head of the Oakland Police Officers Association, and I asked him, did the mayor tell you to use these tactics against the protesters a week ago Tuesday, or did you guys just do it on your own? And he said, we just did it on our own. We just had a general order to clear the park, and it was our decision. So, when you make the most violent people, the people who deal with violence on a daily basis, when you make them responsible for the decision about whether to use violence, guess what's going to be most frequently used. It might carry home from this. So I'm just curious your thoughts on all of that,
Well, I think that before I even answer that, I really think it's important for me to point out that this wasn't a violent movement by the protesters so much as it was a small group of protesters who built the barricade and lit it on fire, and that was a provocative move.
Right. Well, let me also then point out that in the 70s, in every single case, in Detroit, in Oakland, in Watts, I don't remember the list now, and it's been a lot of years. But in every single case, every one of those incidents where city blocks were set on fire was precipitated by a police shooting incident or a police beating incident. Every single one without exception.
Right.
So,
I think I just want to make the point that, one of the chants last night was don't throw stuff. They used a different word that starts with S at the police. So, the vast majority of these protesters do believe in nonviolent revolution. Right. To answer your question, I think that there's two ways of looking at this. Clearly, if you provoke a violent response, you get an enormous amount of media attention to your cause. You get a lot of we've seen in these protests, you get a lot more sympathizers the next day. Again, there was, as I mentioned last week, there was 500 people out there last Tuesday. When I went back out on Wednesday, there was 1,500 people. And last night in Oakland at the port, estimates vary, but there were, I would say, upwards of 10,000 people. So these violent responses have led to a huge amount of participation. Right. But the other way of looking at it is this. First of all, you're not going to win. You're not going to win in a violent confrontation because you are outgunned in a very extreme way, as we see dramatically on each night we see this happening in Oakland.
Right. We have 1 minute, by the way, Joshua.
Okay. The other thing is just looking at the state of our mainstream media. I think it's so easy to dismiss protesters and have them fit the kind of narrative of hooligans that I don't know if that attention ultimately does more than expand among like-minded people.
Well, and in fact, when you look at the coverage on Fox News, where they're calling these basically dirty violent hippies kind of stuff.
Yes.
You could argue that the Reagan Revolution of the 80s was a blowback against the violence of the 70s.
Oh, I think that's a very important point. Yes.
Yeah. So it's like, be careful what you wish for. You might get not only that over the short term, but the exact opposite over the long term.
Or the Nixon revolution as a response to the 60s.
You're absolutely right. In fact, I would say that that's probably even a more clear example, although most of our listeners and viewers are probably not old enough to remember it.
I'm not old enough to remember it either, Tom.
Well, I am. I'll just tell you right up front. I am. And I remember it well. Joshua Holland, editor, reporter, senior writer at alternet.org. Joshua, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Always great. Always great.